Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Podcast. In our continuing series, which is coming to a History 101 end soon, we have Heavy Metal Vikings. 10 questions. Heavy Metal Vikings, we come from the land of the ice and snow. But before we can get to the Heavy Metal Vikings, we kind of have to set up the situation. So we have to talk about what happened to European civilization after the Roman Empire. What happened to the European civilization after the Gothic and Germanic invasions? So when we left off, we have the Roman Empire being invaded by three major linguist groups. The Goths, who came from Scandinavia, moved into what is today Poland, and then were pushed into the Roman Empire in the southeastern European part. They bounced off of the walls of Constantinople, headed over to Italy, sacked Rome in 410, and then ended up in Spain. The other group was the German speakers, and they were all these different groups, all these different tribes, all these different cultures, all these different nations, who for the most part, spent their time fighting each other. Well, when the Huns show up out of Asia and come rolling on their horses into Central Europe, well, the Germanic-speaking peoples got on the move too, and they came into Western Europe. They came into what is now France, the Netherlands, Belgium. The Anglo-Saxon peoples got on boats and fled to England, hoping that getting on the ocean would protect them from people who are on horseback, who have never been, who can't cross the sea. And that's a whole bunch of different peoples. And if you take foreign languages, you kind of know some of their names. There's the Franks, who become the French, but there's the Alemanni, and there's a whole huge Vandals. There's the Vandals. They end up in North Africa. And what happened is that the Western Roman Empire collapsed. European civilization, Roman civilization collapsed into thousands of local kingdoms. Every little chief called themselves a king. There were so many different tribes, so many different lingual groups, so many different leaders. People called themselves leaders. That if you had 800 warriors, you had a large army. You were suddenly powerful. Now, 800 warriors isn't even 1/3 or 1/4 of a legion. The Roman emperor had 200,000 troops that he could command. And they were soldiers. These guys aren't soldiers. These are guys who just pick up something heavy and hit people with. So every little local lord is calling themselves a king. A large army is 800 thugs. There's effectively no written culture outside of the Christian church. Neither the Goths nor the Germans had any sort of permanent writing. And so European civilization collapsed into this quilt of thousands of little patches all over. There's just not a map that shows just how much it fell apart. Because they'll say, oh, this is Germanic France. Well, Germanic France was 800 different little kingdoms. Anglo-Saxon England was, 4, 5, 6. When it starts, it's even more. Remember, there's also Wales. That's what's left of the Romans. So it's even more. So in 400, 500 AD, England and Scotland and Wales are all all these little pieces. They'll consolidate into 4 or 5 large kingdoms. France will become consolidated into France, but it takes a while to do that. This is the opposite of the Arabs, who started out like the Germans and the Goths as nomadic barbarians, but they got stronger from conquering Roman territories. They picked up Roman culture. They lived in Roman cities. They picked up Roman and Greek philosophy, Roman architecture, math, and then took all of those to the next step. They added to all of those. So European civilization collapsed and went into what we used to call the Dark Ages, an age of less and less cultural writing, cultural significance compared to what had been before. The Arabs, on the other hand, were entering a golden age. By the time they hit the Abbasid Caliphate, was it the 700s? Yeah. So we're talking 150 to 200 years from the time of Muhammad. Arab culture is going from illiterate, poor, desert nomad barbarians into a golden cultural age. So what did Charlemagne attempt to correct? Now, his grandfather was Charles Martel, the Hammer, who, took a giant hammer into battle, defeated the Moors, the Muslims at Tours, saved France, saved England, saved Germany from Muslim conquest, pushed the Arabic invaders and Berber invaders back over the Pyrenees to Spain, starts the beginning of what's called the Reconquista, the Catholic reconquest of Spain. It's going to go until 1492. Charlemagne is Charles Martel's grandson. And what he does is, instead of looking south to try to smash the caliphate in Spain, he looks east, across the Rhine River into Germany, to reunite Europe by combining Frankish and Roman political and cultural power. He's a Germanic-speaking Frank. But by combining Germanic Franks with what was around of the Roman culture plus Christianity, boom, you end up with a Holy Roman Empire. It combined Gaul, Germany, Italy, and Christianity. So what Charlemagne, Charles the Great, is attempting to create is a new Roman Empire. And with the help of the Christian church, it's not quite the Catholic Church yet, but with the help of the Christian church, the idea is that we'll recreate Rome. And by combining Gaul and Italy, that's pretty good. That's a real good start. By adding Germany, which was never part of the Roman Empire, you're now doing a couple of things. One is you're ending the fight between Gaul and Germany that had been going on for probably 1,000 years before the Romans ever even showed up, before the Italians show up. And it pushes that border of Europe to the east. The border of Europe was the Rhine. Now it's going to be maybe the Vistula in what is today Poland. It's going to be to the east. And so the definition of what is European changes. And this is a good start. Charlemagne's successors, son, grandsons, if they're good, could then take this whole, this goal, plus Germany, plus Italy, build infrastructure, build it together, the wealth of Italy from trade, the kind of power of Gaul, of the Franks, and the manpower of what is still central Germany. You can combine them all into kind of a unified form. And then you could either wage war against the Arabs in Spain and reconquer Spain, or have a diversion. Go across the sea, go across the Channel to Britain, beat up the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, absorb them into back into a Roman Empire. And then you're really kind of getting close to recreating let's say, the western half of the Roman Empire. It's looking good. It's farther to the east. It has solved the problem of the Germany versus Gaul problem that's so vexed, that will vex Europe for the next 2,000 years, right? World War I, World War II, the wars in the 1600s, the war in the 1700s, all between France and Germany, the wars of Napoleon, same kind of thing. And so you have this new political system that's the start. And with it is this Roman Christian culture underneath it. So what role does Christianity have during Charlemagne? Well, it's dominates education, culture, and European knowledge. Christianity is going to save Greek and Roman writing, which becomes the basis of Christian theology. What language are we writing in? Now, what language do I speak? I am speaking to you in English. But what language do I write to you in? I write to you in Latin. What alphabet do I use? I use Latin. I don't use Greek. And there is no English alphabet. It's 26 letters, all of which were in Latin. We've added a couple, that's true. Some softer sounds, the J, the U, right? Those are going to come out of in Italy and France. But the Christian church is going to dominate education, culture, and European knowledge. And they're going to use Greek and Roman writing, Aristotle, Plato, because those are the basis for Christian theology. To kind of explain the more complicated stuff that is in Christian theology, the most famous of which is the Trinity, right? That there's God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost. Well, those sound like three gods. If you're a polytheist, if you're used to multiple gods, you hear the Trinity and you say that's three gods. And the first thing a Christian priest, a Christian theologian is going to say is, no. They're different aspects of one God. They're indivisible. Jesus is begotten, not made, right? So it's complicated. So you need to know your Greek and your Roman philosophy. You need to know your Greek and Roman science in order to explain the Trinity. So what did Charlemagne's grandsons accomplish? Did they recreate the Roman Empire? Did they bring Europe back together? And if you think Charlemagne's empire is weird, remember, it's France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Italy. That's the start of the EU. That's the start of the EEC back in the 50s. It's the beginning of a new Europe. The EU. Spain will come later. Portugal will come later. Europe is out, and then it's in, and then it might be out again, and it might come back in. So Britain is always this weird thing because it's across the channel. But the core of Charlemagne's empire became the core of the modern EU, the European Union. So it's not weird what Charlemagne was trying to create, where he starts and then tries to build on that. Well, his son, Louis the Pious, he's the pious, right? He gets a good rap from the priests who are writing the chronicles. The problem is he's not Louis the warrior. He's not Louis the unifier. He's not Louis the builder, like, say, Darius was. So he passes. He has three sons, and those three sons are the grandsons of Charlemagne. And what did they accomplish? Well, what they accomplished was to beat each other up. What they accomplished was fighting each other and breaking the empire up into smaller parts. Into three parts. A Western Frankish kingdom, which is a lot of what France is today. An Eastern Frankish kingdom, which is a lot of what is the kind of Austria, Western Germany. And then there's a central empire, which is going to look weird on the map. If you're looking at the thing, it looks weird. It's northern Italy, and then it's Switzerland. It's part of eastern France. It's the Rhine River. And so while it looks weird, geographically, it was connected. Economically, it was connected because it was connected by the Rhine River from the North Sea to the Alps, through the passes, over the Alps, into northern Italy, to the cities of northern Italy. What's lost is Slavic Europe. What's lost is the East. At this point, Poland, but further to the east will be the Baltic states, Livonia, Lithuania, Estonia. What's also lost is the forests of what become Russia, Ukraine, and parts of the Balkan, southeastern Europe. Now, those parts weren't part of Charlemagne's empire. Those parts were the kind of frontier land where the Byzantines were. And so, but what it means is that no Catholic, no Western emperor, no Western king is going to be able to mount a cultural, much less political offensive into Eastern Europe. So Eastern Europe becomes Orthodox Christian. It goes with the Byzantine Empire. The only part that's going to change will be Poland. That will be the one part that will flip, and that's because of a bunch of Germanic Catholic crusades in the 1200s called the Northern Crusades. So Charlemagne's empire breaks up. Europe breaks up into these two pieces, a Catholic West and an Orthodox East. Italy goes from being unified and wealthy to being broken up into small, rich city-state empires that just fight each other most of the time. This is later on we'll get Machiavelli, who will write The Prince and talk about how do you be a leader, how do you be a prince or a king in a world where you're fighting all the time. You know, there is no peace. And what those cities did was to compete to trade with Constantinople's luxuries. Remember, Constantinople is the end of the Silk Road for Europe. So if you want to get silk and spices and all the stuff from China and India, you had to go to Constantinople. And so the cities of Italy, Genoa, Venice, compete. They build navies to go to Constantinople to buy things wholesale, bring them back to Italy, and sell them at retail into Europe. And that's how they're small but rich. But gone, with these civil wars, with the wars between the grandsons, gone was any chance to reunify the Roman Empire. And with that, the chance to reunify Europe. And Europe will never be unified again. The closest we have is the EU today. And it's not. It might be unified in some ways, but in a whole lot of ways, it's not unified at all. Different money systems, 27 different political systems. The Brits aren't even part of it. Different legal systems, different militaries, still different religions. And remember, in the 1500s, we'll make Protestants. So that's even more breakup of the Christian church. So gone was any chance to reunify the Roman Empire, to unify Europe. So that all sounds pretty terrible. Europe is broken up. Any chance of reunifying it has ended. The major imperial states are at war with each other all the time. So what happens next? What happens next is heavy metal Vikings. In the 800s to 1000, Vikings come out of Scandinavia and just wreck coastal Europe and even into the interior of Europe. So where did the Vikings come from and how do they come from there? Well, they come from Scandinavia, this large peninsula right above Germany that is made up of different groups of people become known as the Danes, the Norwegians, the Swedes, and the Finns. The group that lived in Jutland, the peninsula that sticks out of Central European continent towards Scandinavia, will become Denmark. The Danes, those are the Danes. The Norwegians were on the western coast. The Swedes will occupy the central piece, and the Finns the eastern peninsula. And the Danes and the Norwegians invaded and colonized Western Europe. The Swedes and the Finns went east, down the forest rivers of Eastern Europe to Constantinople. And how did they do this? They did it with the Nor, a long, narrow ship with a low draft. Now, the Nor is the trade version of the longboats, of the dragon boats, that are the war version. So the dragon boats have bit more people and more warriors, and they're built for going up the rivers and raiding. The Nor is a similar ship, but it's built for carrying more stuff. But the advantage of these ships is they could go upriver. They could go against the current. And so they could go into the interior of the European continent and attack places that hadn't been attacked in a long time. So what advantage did the Vikings have? Well, the longship allowed for quick invasions deep inland. So no place was safe, which meant the Carolingian army, which was an infantry army, the imperial armies that were the Frankish armies, walked from place to place to place, like the Roman army had. They're too slow to defend everywhere. By the time they would arrive, the Vikings could attack, steal what they wanted, kill who they wanted, get in their boat, and leave. And the Carolingian army wouldn't show up for days or weeks. The other advantage they had was terrorism. They scared people, especially monks, who were both the leaders of the society because they were the only educated people around, and they also had the money of the community, which meant they were the targets. The Catholic churches were probably the only place built of stone in a town, which made them safe from fire. So people stored their savings in the basements, in the grottos, which made the monks both leaders and bankers, and it made them the targets of the Vikings. They had the money. So what effect did the Vikings have on France, England, and Ireland? Well, they raided it, conquered it, and then they kept coming back for more. In Ireland, the Vikings will settle around Dublin and link Ireland and Scotland. A linkage that will continue, that's still linked today. I mean, it's going to continue for 1,000 years, but it's really still going today. So the Vikings, Ireland's pretty far from Scandinavia, and so there's going to be a series of large Viking settlements, but a couple things about Irish history was that it was very broken up. And so the Vikings settling are never able to kind of conquer it and unify it. There's always wars, there's always fighting, and the Vikings, while being probably militarily superior, never have the troops or the colonists that are needed to really settle Ireland, convert Ireland, to make Ireland into a Scandinavian Iceland, right? It's just, they're not able to do it. But they are able to play a significant role in politics to beat up some kings, to ally with other kings, and to be this kind of opposing cultural force in Ireland. In England, they're going to smash 3 of the 4 kingdoms and basically created a Scandinavian country called Daneland. Effectively, the Scandinavians will destroy Anglo-Saxon culture. We may call the Brits Anglo-Saxons. We may call the English Anglo-Saxons. They're not. They're not. Because first, that culture is destroyed by the Scandinavians, and then whatever was left is simply buried over by the French Catholic Viking culture of the Normans after 1066. So that world just comes to an end. You know, we have Beowulf. We got Beowulf out of it. We don't have much else. In France, they're going to raid everything. There's a picture of both England and France of all the different places that the Vikings are going to attack. And you can see they go up all the rivers into the interior of France and raid everything, even Paris, even the capital. And let's face it, if you're a king who can't defend their own capital from terrorists, from raiders, people will believe you're weak. You're not doing your job. And they're going to keep raiding until actually the French king gives northern France to the Vikings. The French king gives northern France to a Viking leader, Rollo. And what he says is, okay, you own this piece. We're going to call it Normandy, the land of the Normans. You get it. It's northern France. And you get it, and you have to defend it. It's yours. You can tax it. You can make money off of it. And if Vikings show up to steal from it, they're stealing from you. And so this was a way for the Vikings to assimilate into Roman French culture while also protecting France. They become French lords, very wealthy French lords. In fact, the Normans will become not only wealthy French lords, Henry V will conquer large parts of northern France, trying to unify it before he's kind of has to leave. But English kings are going to be descended from the Normans after 1066, when William the Conqueror goes from Normandy to England, fights the Battle of Hastings, wins, defeats the Scandinavian culture there, and imports his Romanized Viking French culture that becomes this mess that we now call English. How did France and Germany react to Viking military success? Well, one way we just talked about was you just give the Vikings land and tell them to protect it. The other way was to get rid of their slow armies, was to get rid of the large infantry armies they kind of inherited from the days of the Romans. And they replace it with fast, noble-led knightly armies. They invent the knight, men on horseback, heavily armored men on horseback. These are going to be professional soldiers who can cover large distances and outfight anybody who's foot-based, especially the Vikings. Now, what makes the Normans really dangerous is the Normans become Vikings who pick up horses. And that makes them truly dangerous. In fact, there's an argument that basically our version of a knight, kind of the Sir Lancelot knight, is a Norman knight, is a Norman Viking horse soldier. But what that does is allow a small contingent of knights on their horseback, using the advantages of horses that we've talked about, to outfight foot-based Vikings. The problem is you have to afford that. So that means if you're a king, you have to give a lot of power and a lot of income to the nobility to be able to raise the horses, to be able to not farm land. You have to turn it into grassland so that the horses can eat. They also need time to train, and they also need money in order to buy the armor, to buy the swords, to pay their retinue, to pay their allies, people who will go. One knight isn't enough. You need a bunch of other people. So the kind of sirs that will be underneath the knight. And so that creates feudalism. This idea that the kings give up authority to local lords who needed the independence, the time, the money to train, and the money to finance their knighthood obligations. The idea was the king got loyalty and a more powerful army, but in exchange gave up a lot of money and independence to local lords. So the nobility actually becomes more powerful than most of the kings during this period. And the kings won't get back that power until the invention of cannon. So it's not till the 13, 14, 1500s you start seeing kings act like kings again. So it's going to be a long time where the nobles are could tell the king what to do. We see this in Shakespeare's Henriade, right? The kings are constantly being overthrown by their own lords. What was the Viking relationship with the Byzantine and the Islamic empires? Well, after initially they lost at raiding at Constantinople in 860, like they tried to do against the big empires, the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate, the same thing they did to France and Germany, the less established places. And they lost. I mean, they might win a couple of raids locally, but when they come to Constantinople, they get beat, unlike at Paris where they win. They get defeated at Constantinople. After raids into Spain along the coast, they burn Lisbon, they burn Seville. The Caliphate army, which is a lot of horses, push them back. They'll even build a navy for the Western Mediterranean to also push them back. So in the West, in Constantinople, they're defeated. In Spain, they're also essentially defeated. They'll come back every once in a while and try to raid a soft spot to make some money, but they're not going to conquer parts of Spain the way they do Ireland or England or Normandy, much less just take over a piece like Normandy. In the east, the Swedes and the Finns that go east into the forests and the rivers, like the Volga, they're going to convert to Orthodox Christianity. And they're going to hire themselves as mercenaries to the Byzantine emperors. But the most famous version of this is the Varangian Guard. These giant Scandinavians, giant Swedes for the most part, who carry a double-headed axe into battle. They just scare the hell out of everybody because they stand 6 feet tall. They may weigh 200 pounds or so, and they're just bigger than everybody else. And they come in swinging this giant double-handed sword and just just sweep people out of the way. They also sold pagans, polytheists, of Eastern Europe, and for a time Christians, until they become Orthodox Christians. They sold them as enslaved peoples to the Islamic kingdoms across the Black Sea. So they have a military and an economic connection to the Byzantines and to the Islamic states in the East. They do not have a superior relationship. They have a equal to inferior one. Right? The Constantinople is clearly tougher than they are. And that happens in the culture where these people will become Orthodox. And the Rus, these Eastern Scandinavians, will get absorbed into, will marry into the local Slavic peoples, Slavic elites, and become the Russians, become the Rus. In the West, this is Western France, this is Spain, this is the coast of Morocco. Minor raids accomplished little. And by the 1000s, the Vikings had become Christian. And so what they basically do is stop raiding and join the Christian Spanish kings as allies in the Reconquista. So they hire themselves as mercenaries to what will become Spanish Catholic kings fighting the Reconquista to reconquer reconquer Spain for Christianity. So you can see that where you had real empires, where you had established governments and established armies, the Vikings could raid, could steal, but couldn't have a long-term negative cultural effect on the places. Now, I say negative because it's negative to the people who were living there. You can make the argument that Daneland was superior to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. But the idea was they couldn't occupy Spain the way they occupy Normandy. They couldn't conquer the Black Sea region the way they conquered Ireland. Because the Byzantines and the Caliphate were just too strong, too organized. So that tells you if you want to be protected, you need a strong state with a strong government that can collect the taxes to fund a good army that will protect you. Like that's the lesson of the Vikings. Places that didn't do that, that had conflict, weak governments, weak kings, got terrorized. Places with strong central governments, strong armies, strong tax bases survived, fought back, and either absorbed the Vikings or pushed them away. Well, what about Icelandic poets? Like, what about Viking culture, Scandinavian culture? Was it totally inferior? Did it not matter? Did it disappear? Well, there's a lot of people who argue, yes, that it became Christian, that Sweden and Finland and Denmark and Norway will all become Christian. And so Scandinavian culture didn't matter. But that's just not true. And we know that because of the Icelandic poets. Viking culture, like the Mongols, was too diffuse, too unsettled to present a long-term alternative to the established cultures of Romanized Christian Europe or Islamic Spain, Islamic North Africa. There were too few Scandinavians, too few Vikings spread out in too many places to really completely change places to make them Scandinavian. Right, the one place that really changes completely is Iceland, of which there weren't really any people there. I don't know if there was anyone there when the Vikings showed up. You never want to say never. Never want to say this was totally uninhabited, but, you know, they smashed Germanic Anglo-Saxon culture, sure. But what about French? What about Italian? Islamic? Not a chance. Those cultures, Germanic French, which was tied to Roman Gaul, much less Italy, which goes back to the Etruscans, Islamic Spain. They were just not going to push those cultures around. They were too big, too established. But they do present a challenge in the way history is presented, in the way culture is presented, in a way the values are presented, because their values are different. They are a polytheistic warrior people on the move. So they have warrior gods like Odin and Thor. And they do occupy places, and they do have a culture that does matter. And how do we know that? Because of Icelandic poets. They rocked. And they compete with Christian priests for a dominating role in popular culture and historical remembrance. The biggest form they will take is Icelandic sagas, which are a separate history and a different chronology than the Catholic priest's official version that most of us get. Most of us see the Vikings as bad people who come out of the north, and violence and rape and murder and stealing and terribleness, right? But that's not the sagas. The sagas are heroic, of fighting weak kings and decadent priests who aren't living up to their vows, of a weak God who has abandoned his worshipers because his worshipers are unworthy. They present an alternative, a non-Roman, non-Christian way of seeing European culture. And that hasn't existed essentially since Julian the Apostate, the last Roman emperor who was a polytheist. But it really hasn't lasted since after the days of Constantine. That's the 300s. So we're talking 500 years. Christianity got to write the story, got to tell the tales, got to define the terms. And the only competition is going to be these Icelandic poets who say, whoa, 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 whoa. We have a different way of looking at Europe than you do. We have a different way of looking at religion than you do. We have a different way of looking at the same events as you do. And maybe our way of thinking about things is superior to yours. Now they will lose. The Icelandic poets will lose. Christian priests and the canon will take over history and memory. Roman Christianity will see the Vikings as an interruption rather than an alternative. Why? Well, one, there's not enough of them. There's not enough Icelandic poets. They can rock, but there's not enough of them. And two, Icelandic as a language becomes too isolated to compete with the Romance languages. The Scandinavian languages break up because of distance. And so the sagas are written in an Icelandic and a Scandinavian, in a language that just doesn't have the same weight that Spanish, French, Italian, the Romance languages will. It doesn't have the same user base. It doesn't have the same longevity. You know, Spanish, Italian, and French all go back to Latin, which is 1,000, 2,000 years old by this point. So Icelandic poets are a competition for Christianity. They're a competition for the Catholic priests. They are a competition for established post-Roman culture. But they lose. And the Middle Ages, which kind of begin after the Viking assaults, become an age of Christianity, become an age of where Christian identity overwhelmingly becomes how one saw the world, how one defined the world. And that will be true until the Protestant revolutions of the 1520s. For the next 500 years, Catholic Christianity will kind of define the culture. Okay, so have a good day. Be safe. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.